Well, today we're going to talk about using line in composition. And the function for line, three main ways, there's probably more, but probably the big thing about line in composition is it divides up our picture plane, or canvas, or paper. And how we divide it up makes a big difference, whether we're very symmetrical, all the shapes are even, are balanced. So using line to break up your composition and set up the design that way. The other is using line to define the form by using either outline or contour, which you don't have a lot of that in painting, but some. And of course a lot of that in drawing when using line drawing. And the third is using line to pull the viewer's eye into the composition. That's probably the main one. Or the first two, how we use line to break up our picture plane into those big shapes, those 4 or 5 or 6 large masses, and then how we use line in our painting to lead the viewer's eye through the painting. And we're going to look at some images here from, who do we got? Andrew Loomis, his book. He had a book out, I think it was 30s or 40s, called Creative Illustration. And they just reprinted it about 5 years ago. You used to have to go to the library and get it. But this is it here. It's a big book, big giant book. It was only 27 bucks. Used to, if you found it used somewhere in a fine art bookstore, is about $200, but they reprinted it. It's a good book. It's based on illustration, on composing and painting for advertising, but still hits all the big points that we need to know in painting about value, composition, color, and technique. And he does it in big, simple terms, very easy to read, big ideas you can grasp onto pretty quickly. So it's a good book, and it has a ton of stuff in it. A lot of big pictures. It's more pictures than text, which is my kind of book. But I'd recommend getting it. I think it was $27, which included shipping. So. And you can always find them used for a lot less. So let's go to some images. Well, the other images I have are paintings from E. Martin Hennings, one of the Taos painters. Not necessarily the founder, but he was in Taos art colony. I think from the teens on into, I think he was there till, I think he passed away in the 50s. But we'll look at his paintings and how he used line in his composition. Robin wants to know the name of the book. The name of the book is Creative Illustration. It looks backwards on my screen. I don't know if it is or not. Big book, Creative Illustration from Andrew Loomis. I'll post the name again under the video when we're done here. But we're going to take a look at a few of his images from the book, because he does a good job of really talking about and illustrating composition, and in this case, using line. So let's go to the images here, only a little bit better than that. Now I just photographed these out of the book, so not very straight, but when he's talking about line in terms of breaking up the canvas, you can see here his thumbnail sketch of a figure standing and a figure laying down. And he's using the lines here to show the angle of the figure, how much space it takes up at the bottom. The figure that's standing up, how it's more to the left than the right. And the lines indicate a couple of things. It indicates how he's breaking up the canvas. And the big thing to notice is that these shapes are not equal shapes. These 6, 7 shapes, very unequal shape. None of them are the same size, same shape. And that's the key with breaking up your canvas in terms of shape, using line or not. You want these shapes to be varied, and you want it not symmetrical. We don't want symmetrical, which I'll talk about here in a minute, but a large variety of sizes and shapes, and unequal as far as how they're massed. In other words, it's not symmetrical. But these lines indicate, again, kind of the action of the figure and how they take up space on the picture plane. You can see the sketch over here. And his idea too, or one of the ideas, was to do this first. Now, this is an exercise. Use the lines first to break up your paper in a good composition, a good abstract composition, and then out of that, create an illustration. That probably works better for commercial work back in the day, but it's probably still a good idea as an exercise. It helps you think differently. Now, I do the opposite. I find my subject and I put it down on the canvas or the paper, if I'm doing drawings first, to break up the space the way I want to, the way it creates a good composition. There's several of these here. They're really good illustrations. You can see he's got a few more lines here, and you can see those lines here. Let me use a image. Got this line here, and that line there. Boy, it's hard to draw a straight line there. And then he's got the figures in there. So you can see this helps break up the composition pretty well. So he knows he's got a larger space here, smaller space here. But these are the main lines. I'm not following them very well. The main lines of the composition. And that's how we use line to break up the composition. Here's a more simple one. You got the foreground space. Again, nothing's real straight. Nothing's perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical. You got nice slanted action here, the figure. And you can see how again, the figure's more on the right side, empty space more on the left side, and then the space down below. Big, simple ideas of how to break up space. Again, using line. And that's what we're doing here. This is, the lines don't represent the umbrella or the figures necessarily. This line suggests more action here. But it does show how you're breaking up the space of, in this case, the paper or the canvas when you paint. Break up the space so you're not centered. It gets your mind thinking in terms of placement a little bit better. Now, symmetrical is different. Symmetrical is where you find the center. Boy, it's hard to follow a straight line on this. Find the center that way, find the center this way, and make sure everything is centered. And that's what symmetry is. We're created in a way that we are symmetrical. Half of our face is the same as the other half. One eye, half a nose, half a mouth, one ear. We're very symmetrical. And when you paint or draw that way, you do it for a certain purpose. Andrew here says a formal division or symmetry is best for subjects of a dignified or religious nature, murals where you want symmetry to really prove a point here. But in landscape painting, figure painting, still life, you don't want symmetry. But everything is centered. Equal space on, here you got the face split down the middle. Equal here is here. This part of the hat or the habit is equal on this side. Even the background negative shape is the same on both sides. That's symmetry. And that can be very stiff. In this case, it's very helpful, very useful, and really proves the point of what you're trying to get across. But in landscape painting, again, figurative painting, still life, you don't want this kind of symmetry. So let's look at, of course, when we look at these are all more of a vertical format. Some landscape in here, but they're more geared towards illustration. The two figures here, again, that could obviously be a painting. But when we think of landscape, maybe still life, we're thinking a little more horizontal. Not always, but if we look at something then more horizontal, more landscape oriented, like this picture here, how do we break this up? Now, obviously, you can do the outlines of just the giant masses, the big masses of the vertical trees, slanted hill, sky, and the flat plain. Then a little bit of the creek. But the lines here, again, breaking them up in big, simple lines. I got a shape here, smaller shape here, big shape of the sky, two shapes of the vertical trees, shape of the background hill, two flat plains, and the water. And some of the lines show the motion or the action of the river, but it also shows how this is broken up into unequal shapes. And none of these, I don't think, are the same size, same shape, so it's varied, and that's what we want. Because that's probably the only, and this, again, I get this from Andrew Loomis, the only rule in composition that is probably the most important is to give the greatest variety of spaces possible. No two shapes should look like another in size or shape. So that's a biggie. In all these rules that we're talking about, they're more like ideas of how to think about composition, how to think about value, how to think about color. They're kind of ideals, because in painting you really can't have rules. The rules are somewhat made to be broken. It's best to understand design and composition by understanding these, quote, rules for composition, but don't hesitate to break them for whatever reason. And once you understand them, then you can have a reason for breaking them. And, it may work or it may not work, but it's not that you have to follow every rule. They are kind of suggestions or ideals of what makes a good composition or what constitutes good color harmony. And learning the rules first, and then forming or taking the rules and kind of bending them a little bit every now and then to fit your own idea of what you're trying to get across. There's another photograph here. Again, there's lines here that show the movement, that show the breaking up the surface or the paper or the canvas into shapes. I've got too many here, I got kind of carried away. I can get rid of a couple of those. Let me see. There we go. That's a little bit better. But big masses, big shapes, biggest shape here. All these shapes are different shapes, different sizes, so the composition works. Now, I don't figure out the composition and then do this. I do several small thumbnail drawings where I use these lines to kind of break up the composition. Now, I tend to use shadow pattern more. I think if you've taken any workshops, I talk about shadow pattern. I think it's a lot easier, but helps to understand the use of line to break up these the space a lot better. Now, looking at some paintings by E. Martin Hennings. I forgot what the E stands for, but he was a Chicago artist that moved to Taos, and he had some benefactors. Oscar Mayer, Chicago meatpacking. Oscar Mayer supported him, as well as the mayor of Chicago and some other big company people. Railroads support a lot of these guys in Taos. And So it'd be nice to have Oscar Mayer fund me for a few years so I can go off to Taos to paint. But studied in Chicago at the Art Institute, also studied in Germany, and I think in France, I'm not sure. All those guys studied somewhere in Europe. But you can see here, line-wise, a lot of line because of the trunks, but a lot of broken, big mass, broken shapes, probably the main line here, separating that shape. Then you got, oops, man, it is hard to draw in this thing. That shape, and all these negative shapes between the trees, and then the shape here. So big masses, unequal shapes, nothing is down the middle. You always have one side or the other having most of the weight. This has most of the weight. This has a little less the weight, but focal point is on this side. So it really balances the right side. All these tree trunks from these cottonwoods create a very heavy feel, but balanced by the focal point being on the other side. Nothing is centered though. You know, and again, these kind of lines that have action or movement to it, not a straight line anywhere. Everything has a kind of a flow or movement to it or a rhythm to it, which is part of composition too, finding that rhythm that these lines give in the painting. Another one here, again, a lot of vertical lines, but none of these trees are real straight, and they break up the composition quite a bit. But he doesn't have any of these spaces the same. They're all different spaced, different slant to the trees, and then the shape of the figures here down below. And again, broken up, the shape of the horses and the figures, shape of the background, then the farthest background, the darker trees, and then the tree trunks breaking up the composition, again, unequally. Now, of course, we want to break things up, but we don't want things broken up to where they create an imbalance. And he's using, in a lot of these, what we call the fulcrum level idea of balance. Edgar Payne, in his book, talks about it as, I don't know, if I hadn't had to say it, I would have remembered. Steelyard. I think that the fulcrum level idea is a bit better, but it's the idea that one side of the painting, if we find the center of the painting here, man, hard to draw a straight line. On one side, we have the big shape close to the edge, or close to the center, and then we have the smaller shape on the other side that's a little closer to this edge. So the bigger shape close to the middle, smaller shape gets a little closer to the edge of the painting, in this case on the right side, and that creates a balance. And what that, again, looking at Andrew Loomis's sheet on that, is a page on that. This is the kind of the scale here. Here's the fulcrum, and it's balanced by putting the bigger, the heavier shape close to the middle and the lighter shape close to the edge, and you can make that balanced. You know, it'll stay straight. And that idea is the same as in composition, and you can see his examples here. The bigger shape is close to the middle of the painting, and then the smaller shape, the balance, is close to the edge over here. And again, the rules are made to be broken. It's not that every painting has to have this. There's other ways of finding balance, but this is one I think that's pretty good, and one that Henning's used quite a bit, because he tend to have 2 to 3 figures in his paintings. So here the biggest is in front, the smallest is in back. So he has that here. Same thing here. Biggest closer to the center is in front. The smaller close to the edge is in back. But you can reverse it. You can have the smaller in front. Here you have the smaller weight in front, bigger weight in back, and this is the illustration here. The figure in the background is the bigger shape, and it's, again, closer to the edge, and the smaller one is in front, and it's closer to the right edge. The big one's close to the center, I'm sorry. The bigger mass always close to the center. Hope that makes sense. Same thing here. The smaller one is in front in this case, just like this one, close to the edge of the canvas. The bigger mass or bigger shape is close to the middle, and it's further back. Again, you can reverse those. Bigger one can be in front, smaller one back, and so on. And it can be a bit more even, but this is still a little bit bigger. But if I get them too much the same, trying to draw a straight line down the middle, too much the same from the center line, it's going to start to look a little too symmetrical. So again, here the giant tree, the focal point, real close to the center, and the church back in here, way in the distance, is closer to the edge. And that creates balance. Again, all his are more illustrative shapes, those more square to vertical. But when we look at paintings, a bit more horizontal. And you can see here, this is almost easier to see in shape, but there's still line here. Obviously, the edge of the buildings creates a line to separate the shapes. But get the shape of the sky, shape of the buildings here, shape of these buildings here. And then the shape of the foreground is broken up by two values. And you can see it's not symmetrical. Most of the weight's on this side, balanced by a couple of figures way up here, or this dark over here, closer to the edge. Or a lot of the detail here is closer to the middle of the canvas. And you're always going to find paintings that are good paintings and they break the rules somewhere along the way. But the point is that those rules are there to help us understand what makes a better composition. But you can always stretch them and bend them a little bit. Now here, let's talk about line that he uses to pull the viewer's eye into the painting and around. And here the line we're talking about is like the edge of the water against the edge of the ground here. That creates a line. And here he's got the line on the bank of the water. It's picked up by the line of these rocks, line of the shrubbery, line of the buildings, and it pulls your eye back and around, and it just picks up these lines, these edges. And your eye can really wind around. It can follow. And the line doesn't have to be constant. It can be broken like these shrubbery. They don't necessarily connect, but our eyes will follow this unconsciously, and it leads you back into the composition. Now, the straighter these lines, if this river was just straight, going way back to the mountains, the viewer's eye is going to hit that real quick and then probably run off the side. But when it meanders a bit more, it slows the viewer down, and you can spend more time in these subtleties here. And not that this wasn't like that. It's not, no idea what he was looking at. But it could have been that the creek was really evident all the way in here. And just putting it behind the hill and then letting the shrubbery, broken line of the shrubbery, pick up the viewer's eye and carry them back. And the more you can, I've mentioned this 100 billion times, but the more you can enter, have the lines then at the bottom of the painting, and then pull the viewer's eye. Whether it's over here, pick up these lines. Several different ways you can enter and move around the painting. But if it's a real quick entry, a lot of straight lines, you're going to move away from that painting pretty quickly. So design it so the viewer's eye slows down and stays inside the painting a little bit more. Now this is a drawing. It's got a lot of drawings I've found, and I Don't know if these are just drawings for drawing's sake, or maybe they were drawings for etchings, or even for paintings. A lot of artists will do more finished drawings. In other words, drawings where they have a set number of values, 4 or 5 values, to help simplify. But you could do a painting from this drawing, not because it has a ton of detail, but because the composition is really designed and good value relationships, and you got pretty much a value and a shape back in here, even though he has 2 values. And then the value of the cottonwood branches, value of the background, dark trees, light snow, dark shadow. And still you have that line here leading you into the picture plane, picking up some of these big branches and following those branches around. It can really wind around all day in here. A lot of stuff here to get caught up in. And that's what makes a really good composition. Same thing with the figure. You know, you got the space broken up real nice. The window shape. Shape of the figure broken up with 1, 2, 3 values. Shape of the pumpkins, the 2 values in the background blue wall. You know, nicely broken up into big shapes. At some point you get too many shapes and it becomes too detailed. So with the plan of keeping things more simple, it's always going to work a lot better. There's always something about people holding sharp knives. A little scary. Then we have something like this, where you have real straight lines here. Again, I can't draw a straight line on this thing. There, and a real straight line here. Even though this isn't straight, it still goes all the way across the canvas, which would just cut up the canvas into shapes that aren't very good. So he breaks that up with these figures. These figures are kind of the stopping point. They keep your eye from just running off the canvas. And again, he's got one shape here close to the center and 2 shapes here that create one shape close to the edge. Creates a little bit better balance. So broken up nicely, but a little more of a modern, almost abstract look to it. Then there's one in here, well, not this one. But again, your eye picks up this line from the shadow, and it can go a bunch of different places and just wind all over the place. There's a lot of line going on in here. You know, the eye can really travel around. And you might say, well, yeah, he's probably looking at that stuff and he's seeing all that stuff and he's just putting down what he's seeing. But finding a composition that works is more than half the battle. Too often we find something and try and paint it and there's no composition there. We don't spend time composing or looking for something that makes a good composition. But finding something that has lines that pull the viewer's eye in, that has a good shadow pattern, shapes that are broken up into big solid masses that break up the space well, not too even, not too symmetrical. I mean, all that is composing. And it's not the fun part. It's not as fun as adding detail to a painting or mixing color. But it's what makes a painting work. That and the values. Values and composition kind of go hand in hand because you're using those value changes to create shape. Of course, at first you're using line just to break it up. But when you're using the line or the shape, see how few shapes you can have in there to create the composition. Instead of individual shrubbery back in here, the shrubbery becomes one big shape. Same thing here. It's not individual shrubbery, it's one big shape. Same thing with the shadow pattern. He's got a few individual small little shapes of dark, but most of it's that big pattern. So he's got about 7 or 8 large masses here in lines that break up the canvas. And the more you can practice that without thinking about painting, the better. In other words, do that with just a sketchbook. And go outside and do as many thumbnails using line to break up the shape, and also using big masses. Make sure when you do that outside, when you do a thumbnail, have a picture plane first. In other words, have the 4 sides and the top, or the 2 sides, the top and the bottom. And I usually have cutouts, little thin cardboard cutouts for different sizes, 8 by 10, 9 by 12, and I just trace them on there. Squares, longer shapes, more vertical shapes. Don't just start drawing on the paper. You have to have a framework to break up to start with. So too often I see thumbnails where you're just doing the thumbnail on a paper without a designed shape first, without a, like an 8 by 10, 6 by 8, or a square or a vertical. Now this is a night scene, and again, you can see the big masses, the big shapes, and the lines they create. A little bit of a line down here that pulls the viewer's eye in. And again, it's not real straight, real perfect, kind of broken, and that makes the eye meander around a bit more. You can really kind of go all over the place. Then wind back out and come out down near the bottom again. A lot of lines to pull the viewer's eye in and to allow it to travel around in the composition. Now this is one where you can say he broke the rules quite a bit, because here you have the line created by these 2 shapes, the dark and the light shape of the chamisa there, and the line at the top of the dirt. Nothing breaks those up, and your eye just follows that real strong line right off the canvas. Same thing with the line up there. So he chose not to break it up for whatever reason. Ordinarily he'd have a figure here on a horse, typical Hennings. And that breaks up that line. Your eye follows this line, or follows these lines in here, and hits the horse and goes up. So the horse and the rider kind of act as a stop to keep the eye from running off. Now there's no stop, and your eye can just run off. Or you could have a tree here to break it up, or something. It doesn't really matter what it is, skyscraper. He does break up the distant line of the blue hills with these shrubbery. That breaks it up. But again, rules are made to be broken. It still has shapes here. This shape of the dirt, shape of the blue and the light clouds, shape of the small blue shapes of the distant hills. Makes nice abstract shapes in there. Good composition. It just needs a vertical somewhere to break those lines, to create a stop there, keep your eye from running off. We have a few more here. This is another one. All these are pretty much around Taos. Again, those lines, if you broke this up in terms of line, you would have lines going in here, so that you have, again, 5 or 6 big shapes, 4 or 5 big lines that kind of break up the shape. Then he has lines pulling you in. The line of the road pulls the viewer. Let me get rid of line of the road and the shrubbery, kind of pulling the viewer in, and then picks up these lines back in here. And what he was looking at could have a suggestion of those, and he's created, taken what's there and refined it to make better shapes, better lines to pull the viewer in. I don't necessarily assume that it was all like this. And you can over-design, like I've said before, and create too much of an obvious line that pulls the viewer's eye back. He does have here this line, diagonal line that's goes from one side to the other and does kind of cut off the bottom of the painting. Just to lift this tree up a bit more would stop that line. Some kind of vertical, anything to break these long lines that go from one side to the other or from top to bottom. They tend to just cut off the canvas instead of creating shapes that pull the viewer's eye in instead of just straight out. It's another drawing. Again, the drawing looks detailed, but squint your eye a little bit at it, and there's just big solid, there's about 3 or 4 values here. He doesn't have a lot of values. He's got a lot of small darks and lights, detail. But even without that, this would work real well. The real light cottonwood, the shape of those small branches of the cottonwood, shape of the trunks. Most of the shape of the cottonwood trunks is shown in the shadow pattern. Now he's added more detail to it, but it doesn't have to be there. It would still work without the detail. And this is probably more of a finished drawing. I think drawing for drawing's sake. Because if it was a study for a painting, I would guess not as much detail, or you wouldn't need it anyway. But you could, obviously if you want a little more finished painting. But it's from that era where they relied more on drawings probably than photographs, although I know they used photographs quite a bit. Certainly not color photographs. And I think certainly they relied more on drawings along with the photo. Which I think that's what they have over us. They rely more on what they see visually rather than relying on photographs. And I think that makes them a little better painters to some degree. Now this is, I don't know if you used the drawing before. I've seen a couple of drawings of this area. These cottonwoods, you can see the slant of the cottonwoods. It's the same area here, only he's painted. I don't know if he used same fence in the background, same trees, hill in the background. He just changed up the figures and the horses. But again, your eye comes in at the bottom, goes up the horse, and just a ton of different areas to wind around in here. All these angled lines of the branches, slanted big lines of these trunks. Nothing's too straight, too vertical, too horizontal. Even this line here is slanted a little bit. And again, there's a stop here of these trees. So nothing that pulls you out of the canvas real quickly. And enough variation of line to pull your eye around. And that creates rhythm. The more your eye can flow throughout a painting, that's the idea of having a good rhythm in your painting. So, and of course his values are very, very accurate too. Really good painter. I think that's all I have here. Back to the beginning. So think in terms of seeing things in terms of shadow pattern to set up composition, but also do some thumbnail drawings and look at things in terms of line, how you can break up your canvas or paper in terms of line to give you bigger shapes. And think about weight, how you're going to set up the weight. And the more you can practice this separately from just painting, I think the better it sinks in. Loomis's book has a lot of exercises to go through. So look here, see if there's any questions before I sign out here. Again, the artist is Andrew Loomis. Later back in the 20s, 30s, 40s. This is the book, big book. Again, it's newly in print. And it's about 27 bucks. I think I paid 27, and that included shipping, so really inexpensive. Well, that'll do it. Let me know if you have any comments. You can make some comments below the video after it's posted, and we'll talk to you next time.